They say solitude is a heavy thing, that silence can be cruel. That being alone, especially for a woman, is a kind of failure. Yet beneath those societal whispers lies a truth far more profound. Solitude is sacred. It is not a void to escape, but a temple to enter. It is where a woman meets her essence without interference, without distortion, without the constant noise of needing to be understood. A woman who chooses to live alone has not surrendered to loneliness. She has chosen truth over distraction. In a world that constantly tells her to give, to please, to nurture, she dares to retreat into her own stillness. And in that retreat, she begins to hear something she's never truly listened to before, the sound of her own soul. The external world calls it silence, but within that silence there is music, there is movement, there is the hum of life itself, asking her to remember who she was before she was told who to be. Solitude is not absence, it is presence, the deepest kind. It strips away the illusions of validation and forces a woman to face what is real. It brings her face to face with her fears, her forgotten dreams, and her untamed emotions. At first, it can feel like an exile. There is discomfort in meeting yourself after years of playing roles. There is pain in realizing how much of your identity was shaped by others, their needs, their opinions, their love, their rejection. But as she moves through the layers of silence, she discovers something extraordinary. The loneliness she once feared begins to transform into serenity. The emptiness turns into spaciousness. The solitude becomes sacred. To live alone as a woman is to walk through the fire of self-confrontation. There are no mirrors reflecting her worth through another's eyes. There are no voices to tell her who she should be. There is only the quiet whisper of her own intuition. Ancient, feminine, and wise. This is where the alchemy begins. She starts to rebuild herself not as the woman the world expects, but as the woman she truly is. The sacred solitude teaches her the difference between isolation and independence. Isolation is what happens when the world turns away. Independence is what happens when she turns inward. One comes from fear, the other from freedom. In this sacred state, she begins to understand that her happiness was never meant to depend on another's affection. Her worth was never meant to be measured by companionship. Her peace was never meant to be borrowed. It was always hers. There is a quiet power in the way she begins to live. Her mornings become rituals, not rushed, not distracted. Her home becomes an extension of her spirit. Every corner reflects her inner world, simplicity, depth, meaning. She is not waiting for someone to arrive. She is already complete. She begins to savor the small things, the sound of rain, the warmth of her own hands, the softness of her breath. What once felt like emptiness now feels like abundance. In the sacred solitude, a woman begins to unlearn the myth that her value lies in being chosen. She realizes that her real power lies in choosing herself. The voices that once made her doubt her independence begin to fade, and in their absence, her true voice emerges, strong, clear, unshakable. This voice does not seek permission, it declares existence. Through solitude, she reconnects to the ancient feminine within, the healer, the creator, the mystic. She begins to trust her intuition again, to honor her emotions as sacred teachers, to treat her body as a temple of divine intelligence. The world told her that being alone means being incomplete, but in solitude, she sees the opposite. She realizes that only through aloneness can she become whole. The sacred solitude also reveals the shadow. It forces her to confront her hidden fears: fear of abandonment, fear of being unseen, fear of fading into irrelevance. These are the old imprints of dependency that society has carved into her. But as she sits with them, she does not run. She lets the fear speak, and then she listens. Slowly, she begins to see that the fear was never hers. It was inherited, passed down through generations of women told to seek safety in others. In solitude, that cycle breaks. She becomes the first in her lineage to stand alone without trembling. Her solitude is not rebellion, it is remembrance. A return to the original feminine power that existed long before love was defined by need. The sacred solitude is also a mirror. It reflects everything she once gave away. She sees how often she silenced herself for harmony, how often she dimmed her light for acceptance, how often she gave her energy to those who could not meet her depth. But instead of shame, she feels compassion. For she now understands that every compromise was simply a longing to belong. And now she belongs to herself. As the days pass in her chosen solitude, she begins to feel a strange kind of companionship, not with another, but with life itself. The wind feels like conversation. The moon feels like an ally. The stillness becomes her confidant. She is no longer waiting to be loved. She is practicing love in its purest form, as presence, as awareness, as gratitude. The sacred solitude does not make her cold. It makes her radiant. It does not make her distant. It makes her real. It strips her of pretense, of performance, of the endless chase for validation. What remains is essence, wild, honest, and unafraid. She does not seek the world's approval anymore because she has met something far greater within herself. Peace. Not the peace that comes from comfort, but the peace that comes from knowing she can stand alone and still feel whole. In this sacred space of aloneness, she discovers that being without a man does not mean being without love. It means being immersed in a deeper love, one that cannot be taken, abandoned, or betrayed. It is the love of the soul for itself, the love that births all others, the love that begins when the noise finally stops. There comes a moment in a woman's life when she can no longer deny the quiet truth growing within her. The realization that she has spent years building her identity around what others expected, needed, or demanded from her. This realization is not gentle. It shakes the ground beneath her feet, dissolving the illusion that love must come through dependency, that safety must come from attachment, that validation must come from being needed. This is the beginning of a profound inner death, the death of dependency. It does not happen overnight. It begins as discomfort, as subtle awareness that the patterns that once felt secure now feel suffocating. The roles she once played with pride, the caretaker, the lover, the pleaser, begin to feel heavy. The words that once soothed her now sound hollow. The very connections she once clung to start revealing their true purpose, not to comfort her, but to awaken her. Dependency has always been the invisible chain woven into the fabric of her conditioning. From childhood, she was taught to seek approval to feel worthy, to obey to feel loved, to give endlessly to feel safe. Her emotions were trained to orbit around others, her self-worth dependent on how much she was desired, accepted, or praised. But the soul has its own intelligence, and when it tires of living in servitude, it begins to rebel. This rebellion is not loud or angry. It is quiet and relentless. It whispers through her fatigue, her heartbreaks, her disappointments. It tells her, you are more than who you are to others. The death of dependency begins the moment she stops romanticizing sacrifice, when she sees that giving too much of herself was not love, but fear disguised as devotion. She begins to understand that dependency is not connection. It is control wearing the mask of care. The need to be needed once gave her purpose, but now it feels like a cage. She starts questioning why she must keep shrinking to be loved, why she must dim her brilliance to be accepted, why her boundaries must bend for others to stay. Each question burns away a layer of illusion. In this death, she faces discomfort that feels almost unbearable. There is grief in letting go of old patterns, grief for the woman who believed her worth depended on how well she performed love. She feels the ache of emptiness when she stops rescuing, when she stops chasing, when she stops trying to prove her value. At first, the silence feels cruel, but within that silence, something miraculous happens. Space appears, space for her own thoughts, space for her own desires, space for her own truth. As she walks through this internal death, she begins to see how dependency was never about love, but about fear. Fear of abandonment, fear of rejection, fear of not existing without someone else's recognition. She sees that dependency is not intimacy, it is avoidance. It keeps her from knowing her own depth. When she was dependent, she did not truly connect, she conformed. She adjusted her energy to fit others, to keep them close, to not lose what she thought she needed. But love that requires her to disappear is not love. It is survival dressed in sentiment. In the death of dependency, she learns to sit with the discomfort of her own company. She starts to nurture herself in ways she once expected others to do. She begins to feed her spirit, tend to her needs, and honor her emotions without waiting for someone else to validate them. This is not selfishness, this sovereignty. Dependency dies the moment she realizes that her wholeness does not require permission. The death of dependency also exposes how much of society's idea of womanhood was built on pleasing others. A woman was taught to be gentle, even when wronged, to forgive even when betrayed, to care even when depleted. But now she begins to see that compassion without boundaries is self-destruction. She begins to redefine love as mutual growth, not mutual exhaustion. She learns that saying no is not rejection, but self-respect. Through this transformation, she starts to notice something. The world reacts. People who once thrived on her compliance now call her distant. Those who depended on her giving call her selfish. Those who benefited from her silence call her changed. And she is changed. She no longer dances to the rhythm of others' needs. She no longer mistakes attachment for affection. She no longer trades her peace for proximity. In this death, she is not losing love, she is purifying it. The kind of love she once knew was transactional, built on what she could provide, how much she could endure, how deeply she could empathize without losing herself. But now she seeks something deeper, a love that does not demand her to disappear. She begins to build a new foundation, not of dependency, but of balance, where love becomes a meeting of two complete beings, not two fragments clinging to fill each other's voids. The death of dependency is also the birth of trust. Trust in her own strength, trust in life, trust in the wisdom of solitude. She no longer fears being alone because she understands that aloneness is not the absence of love. It is the space where real love is born. The moment she stops needing someone to complete her, she becomes complete. Through this process, She begins to feel her own power returning. It is quiet but undeniable. She no longer waits for approval to feel valuable. She no longer seeks attention to feel visible. She no longer sacrifices her intuition for the illusion of belonging. Every boundary she sets is an act of liberation. Every truth she speaks is an act of self-respect. Every moment she chooses peace over pleasing, she kills another remnant of dependency that once ruled her life. And though this death may feel like loss, it is the most sacred loss of all. The loss of everything false. When dependency dies, love is no longer a transaction but a reflection. She begins to attract not those who feed on her light, but those who stand in their own. She begins to experience relationships that are rooted in truth, not need. She begins to understand that the most powerful form of love begins where dependency ends. There is a quiet revolution taking place within the hearts of women, not in the streets, not in slogans, but in the unseen corners of the soul. It is the slow, sacred rebirth of the feminine psyche. For generations, women have been taught to fragment themselves, to silence their instincts, to doubt their intuition, to shift into what was acceptable, beautiful, or useful. But the old patterns are collapsing, and something ancient is stirring again, a remembering, a reawakening of the lost feminine consciousness that once moved freely through the world before it was tamed. The rebirth of the feminine psyche begins with disillusionment. It starts the moment a woman realizes that the identities she inherited were never hers. The roles of nurturer, lover, mother, pleaser, though sacred in their essence, became prisons when stripped of authenticity. She begins to see how much of her life has been spent performing versions of womanhood that serve everyone but herself. The world rewarded her compliance, not her truth. But deep within, a quiet rebellion brews, a call to return to the parts of herself she was taught to suppress: her intuition, her wiredness, her emotions, her knowing. This rebirth is not graceful, it is raw and unrefined. It feels like tearing down the scaffolding of centuries from her own psyche. It demands that she confront the shadows of internalized shame, guilt, and fear. For too long, she has been told that her emotions make her weak, that her sensitivity is a flaw, that her power must be hidden. But in her awakening, she begins to see that her emotions are not weakness, they are language. Her sensitivity is not fragility, it is perception. Her power was never meant to be silent, it was meant to be sovereign. In the process of rebirth, she meets her inner split, the conflict between the woman she was conditioned to be and the woman she truly is. This confrontation is painful because it requires her to release the false identities that once kept her safe. The people around her may no longer recognize her. Some will call her changed, others will call her lost. But she is neither. She is becoming whole. The rebirth of the feminine psyche cannot occur without grief. There is mourning in realizing how much she abandoned herself to be loved. She grieves for the times she softened her voice to avoid rejection, for the times she apologized for her intuition, for the times she doubted her worth because the world did not mirror it back. She feels the sorrow of centuries flowing through her veins, the collective memory of women silenced, dismissed, objectified, and unseen. Yet within that grief, there is also healing, because when a woman allows herself to feel the pain of generations, she also inherits their strength. Through the process of rebirth, she begins to remember her sacred nature. She reconnects to the rhythm of life, to the intelligence of her body, to the wisdom of her emotions. She starts listening to her intuition again, that quiet voice that always knew but was buried beneath conditioning. It tells her when something feels wrong, when someone's energy is not aligned, when she is betraying herself. The more she listens, the more her power returns. This rebirth is not about rejecting the masculine, it is about balancing it. For centuries, the world has worshipped the masculine principles: logic, control, dominance, productivity, while dismissing the feminine ones: intuition, flow, receptivity, creation. A woman in her rebirth integrates both. She learns to act with purpose, yet move with grace, to lead with strength, yet nurture with softness, to think with clarity, yet feel with depth. She no longer sees these qualities as opposites, but as partners within her own psyche. As she awakens, her perception of love also changes. She no longer confuses attachment with intimacy or sacrifice with devotion. She begins to understand that love without self-awareness is dependency, and that nurturing others while neglecting herself is not compassion. It is imbalance. In her rebirth, she learns that real love begins within, when she finally gives herself the tenderness she always offered to others. From that place, her relationships transform, not out of need, but out of resonance. The rebirth of the feminine psyche also brings with it a creative resurgence. When a woman reconnects with her inner essence, she becomes a channel for life itself. Her creativity is no longer limited to art or expression. It becomes the way she moves through existence. She creates beauty out of stillness, meaning out of pain, and wisdom out of experience. Her intuition begins to guide her toward alignment. The career, the environment, the relationships that reflect her truth. The more she trusts this inner compass, the more magnetic she becomes. But this rebirth requires courage. The world is still uncomfortable with women who refuse to conform. When she speaks her truth without softening it, she will be called defiant. When she chooses solitude over shallow connection, she will be called cold. When she sets boundaries, she will be called difficult. Yet she continues, because she understands that every label is simply a projection from those who fear what they do not understand. A woman who belongs only to herself. In the sacred fire of transformation, she sheds the old definitions of success and beauty. She no longer measures her worth through appearance, approval, or achievement. She begins to see beauty not as something to display, but as something to embody. It is the glow of integrity, the peace of alignment, the quiet confidence that comes from living truthfully. The rebirth of the feminine psyche is not a return to innocence, but a return to authenticity. It is the awakening of ancient wisdom through modern consciousness. It is the end of pretending, the end of shrinking, the end of waiting to be saved. Through this process, she becomes her own sanctuary, self-nurturing, self-guided, self-illumined. She begins to feel the cycles of nature moving through her again, the waxing and waning, the rising and falling, the endless dance of creation and release. She realizes that her essence was never linear, never logical, never meant to fit into rigid structures. It is fluid, mysterious, ever changing. She is no longer afraid of her depth, her rage, her softness, her sensuality. They are all sacred expressions of the same divine current flowing through her being. In the rebirth of the feminine psyche, the woman who once sought to be understood now seeks only to be real. The woman who once sought to be chosen now chooses herself. The woman who once sought to please now seeks to awaken. What is being reborn within her is not just a new version of herself, but the remembrance of the eternal feminine that lives in every woman, the part that knows, feels, creates, and transforms with the rhythm of life itself. Every woman who walks the path of awakening eventually comes face to face with a reflection she has long avoided, the shadow. It does not come to punish her, it comes to free her. The shadow is not evil or unworthy. It is simply the part of herself she has buried beneath perfection, beneath people pleasing, beneath the endless pursuit of acceptance. It is everything she was told not to be: her anger, her jealousy, her ambition, her sensuality, her grief, her raw truth. The mirror of the shadow shows her the face she was never allowed to wear. When a woman begins to live alone or steps away from the constant noise of validation, the shadow begins to surface. In the silence, there is no one left to perform for. There are no roles to play, no applause to earn. There is only the truth. And truth, when it first reveals itself, is rarely gentle. It shows her the patterns she's repeated for years. The self, betrayal hidden behind kindness, the resentment disguised as loyalty, the fear that pretends to be love. It forces her to see the masks she's worn to survive and the price she's paid to wear them. The mirror of the shadow does not flatter. It reflects everything she's denied. It shows her how much energy she spent hiding the parts of herself that once threatened her acceptance. The part that wanted to say no but smiled instead. The part that wanted to rest but kept giving. The part that wanted to scream but stayed silent. These fragments live in her body like ghosts. They whisper through her fatigue, her anxiety, her restlessness. They ask to be seen, not judged. Facing the shadow is not comfortable work. It requires brutal honesty, not about others, but about herself. She begins to ask the difficult questions. Why does she keep attracting people who drain her? Why does she fear being disliked? Why does she apologize for existing? Every question pulls her deeper into her own reflection. The deeper she looks, the more she realizes that her shadow is not her enemy. It is her mirror. It shows her the unhealed wounds that dictate her choices. It reveals the unconscious scripts she's been living by, written long ago by pain and fear. The world teaches women to be light, to smile, to forgive, to understand, to endure. But when she meets her shadow, she begins to see the value of her darkness. The rage she was taught to suppress becomes her clarity. The grief she was told to hide becomes her depth. The jealousy she was shamed for becomes her compass, revealing where she has abandoned herself. Every emotion she once labeled as bad becomes sacred information. The shadow does not seek to destroy her light, it seeks to integrate with it. The mirror of the shadow is like standing before a version of herself she barely recognizes. Wild, honest, unfiltered. At first, she resists. She tries to analyze, to fix, to rationalize what she sees. But the shadow cannot be healed through logic. It must be felt. It must be embraced with compassion. The moment she stops trying to correct her darkness and starts listening to it, something shifts. The energy that once fueled her guilt transforms into power. The emotions that once overwhelmed her become teachers. The parts she feared most become allies. Through this mirror, she also sees how her relationships have mirrored her inner fragmentation. Every person who triggered her was simply reflecting a part of her she had not yet accepted. The friend who betrayed her showed her where she betrayed herself. The lover who ignored her revealed the parts of her that ignored her own needs. The critic who judged her exposed the voice of her own inner judge. What once looked like pain begins to reveal itself as guidance. Every shadow mirrored in others leads her back home to herself. The process of integrating the shadow is not about erasing darkness, but about dissolving division. She begins to see that light and dark are not opposites. They are partners in growth. Her joy becomes more authentic because it no longer denies pain. Her compassion deepens because it now includes herself. Her confidence strengthens because it no longer depends on perfection. When she stops fearing her shadow, she becomes whole. The mirror of the shadow also reveals the collective conditioning that women have carried for centuries. They have been taught to hide their assertiveness as aggression, their ambition as arrogance, their sensuality as sin. These are not flaws, they are power distorted by shame. As she reclaims them, she begins to embody the full spectrum of her being, soft and fierce, tender and strong, grounded and wild. This integration transforms her energy. People begin to sense it without her saying a word. She no longer over-explains, over-apologizes, or over-gives. Her presence becomes calm yet commanding. She no longer needs to prove her goodness because she has embraced her wholeness. The woman who once feared her own emotions now moves through them with grace. She no longer runs from discomfort. She listens to it. She no longer blames others for her pain. She learns from it. The shadow is not an obstacle to enlightenment. It is the doorway to it. Without facing the shadow, awakening remains incomplete, floating on the surface of spirituality while avoiding the depths of humanity. When she looks into the mirror of her shadow, she realizes that everything she sought outside, love, peace, freedom, was waiting within the darkness she feared to touch. Through this mirror, she learns the art of self-compassion. She forgives herself for the choices made from pain, for the times she silenced her truth, for the years she spent pretending. She begins to understand that every version of herself was simply trying to survive. Her shadow was never evil, it was just unloved. And now, in the sacred light of awareness, she gives it what it always needed: acceptance. In the mirror of the shadow, she stops trying to become perfect and starts becoming real. The faces she wore fall away, and beneath them she finds her true reflection, not flawless, but whole. It is here, in the union of her light and darkness, that she begins to move differently through the world, not from fear of being seen, but from the peace of being known by herself. There comes a stage in a woman's evolution when she no longer seeks to be understood or accepted. She seeks to be free. This is the birth of the sovereign spirit. It is not rebellion and it is not arrogance. It is the quiet reclamation of power that was never truly lost, only forgotten. The sovereign spirit arises when a woman stops looking for permission to exist and starts standing in the full truth of who she is. She has known dependence, she has known heartbreak, she has known the weight of expectations. She has been told to soften, to wait, to compromise, to be agreeable. For years, she molded herself into shapes that made others comfortable. She silenced her voice for peace, withheld her truth for love, and diminished her light for acceptance. But one day, something inside her breaks, not in despair, but in awakening. The illusion of needing to be completed by someone else dissolves, and she finally meets the strength of her own soul. The sovereign spirit is born in the ashes of self-abandonment. It emerges from the ruins of dependency and rises with quiet dignity. No longer does she measure her worth through the eyes of others. No longer does she seek validation through approval or affection. She begins to understand that true power is not given, it is claimed. It is not loud, it is steady. It is not dominance, it is alignment. The woman who embodies the sovereign spirit no longer lives according to external scripts. She stops chasing what was never hers and stops apologizing for what she naturally is. Her choices begin to reflect inner truth, not outer pressure. She does not move to please, she moves to align. Every decision becomes an act of integrity. Every boundary becomes a declaration of self-respect. Every moment of solitude becomes sacred ground. This sovereignty is not isolation, it is inner authority. It is the knowing that she can walk alone and still feel whole. It is the realization that her happiness, her security, and her peace are not dependent on another person's presence or absence. It is the deep understanding that love, when authentic, enhances freedom. It does not replace it. The sovereign spirit is not interested in control, but in mastery, mastery of the self. She no longer reacts from wounds, she responds from wisdom. She no longer confuses silence with weakness or compassion with compliance. She knows when to speak and when to remain still. She knows when to walk away without resentment and when to stay without losing herself. Her strength is not forceful, it is effortless, born from self-knowledge. When she looks back, she sees how much energy was once wasted trying to be everything to everyone. She sees how she diluted her truth to fit into spaces too small for her soul. She sees how she called it love when it was really a negotiation of her spirit. But now her love is different. It flows freely, without attachment, without expectation. It is not given to earn something. It is given because she has become the source. The sovereign spirit does not seek to dominate or prove superiority. She no longer competes with others or compares herself to illusions. She knows that every woman carries her own rhythm, her own medicine, her own sacred path. To be sovereign is to walk that path with authenticity, even when it defies the collective current. She honors other women not as rivals, but as reflections of the same sacred essence, expressing itself through different forms. This inner sovereignty transforms how she relates to the world. The noise of society, the opinions, the gossip, the judgments, no longer pierces her like it once did. She listens, but she does not absorb. She observes, but she does not internalize. The opinions of others lose their grip because she has anchored herself in a truth deeper than approval. When the world tries to define her, she smiles because no label can contain what is boundless. The sovereign spirit is deeply intuitive. She trusts her inner knowing more than the voices outside her. She moves in rhythm with her intuition. Sometimes that rhythm is bold and fiery, sometimes still and soft. She no longer fears the fluctuations of her emotions. She sees them as the language of her soul. Her sensitivity becomes her strength, guiding her toward alignment and away from anything that diminishes her energy. There is a serenity that surrounds her now, not because life has become easy, but because she no longer resists its lessons. She has made peace with uncertainty, understanding that control is an illusion and surrender is power. She no longer chases outcomes, she participates in creation. Her focus has shifted from trying to change the world to mastering her inner world. And in doing so, she influences everything around her effortlessly. The sovereign spirit walks with grace because she is no longer fragmented. She has met her shadow, embraced her pain, and integrated her contradictions. She has made peace with being both fierce and gentle, both vulnerable and strong. She no longer tries to choose between softness and strength because she understands they are not opposites. They are allies. Her sovereignty is found in this balance, this wholeness. She is unshaken by abandonment because she no longer abandons herself. She is undiminished by rejection because she no longer rejects her own truth. She is untouched by manipulation because she no longer bargains with her boundaries. Her energy is her empire, and she guards it not with walls, but with awareness. In her sovereignty, she no longer needs to prove her worth to be chosen. She no longer chases after love that must be convinced to stay. She has become her own anchor, her own home, her own sanctuary. The love she offers now comes from overflow, not from longing. It is a love rooted in presence, not performance. The sovereign spirit lives not in resistance to the masculine, but in harmony with it. She honors the divine masculine as a complement to her own essence, not as a replacement for it. When she meets a partner, she no longer surrenders her power to be loved. She meets him as an equal, as a mirror, as another sovereign being walking beside her, not above or below. To live as a sovereign spirit is to live untamed by fear and untouched by pretense. It is to embody the truth that freedom and love are not opposites, but twins, born from the same sacred fire. It is the quiet confidence that rises when a woman finally realizes she was never meant to be possessed, defined, or controlled, because her spirit was always meant to be her own.